What's going on, guys? I hope you guys are doing very well today. I wanted to bring up this topic about this concept that many people are taught today, especially younger people, and this definitely more so influences younger women than younger men, which is, can masculinity be toxic, right? So it is a very nuanced question. It's not something that's either yes or no, because masculinity is not something that is like a neat little package that you can take and just store it on the shelf, and then whenever you need it, you take it out of the shelf and you look at it again. So the answer is both yes and no. But I also want to be clear, right? Is masculinity inherently toxic? The answer to that is no, it's actually not. Masculinity is inherently good, right? Now, some people might push back and say, okay, well, what about the times when there are guys who beat up their girlfriends, or they beat up their wives, or their sisters, or their mothers, or their grandmothers, or whatever it is, right? So they use like instances of violence, aggression, murder, rape, things like that, in order to prove that masculinity is toxic. But that's not proof of masculinity, right? Any more than gossiping or backstabbing or character assassination are proof of femininity. But I think it is fair to say that it's proof of toxic masculinity, right? So that means that whenever you are doing things that on the surface are masculine, right? So they have something that is in common with masculinity at a surface basic level, but deep down inside, that's not a very masculine behavior, like murder, right? Or aggression or physical violence. On the surface level, it looks very masculine, right? And it has a surface level commonality with masculinity. That is actually true. But that's not what masculinity is about, right? That is a deviation. That's a deviance, right? So while it might fall under the umbrella of masculinity, it is a toxic form of it, right? So that's not a proof that all masculinity is toxic. It's like, think of it this way, guys, right? Let's just say that the city that you live in, right? Assuming that the city that you live in is mostly, it's not a war-torn society, it's not inside of a war-torn country. It's mostly safe. It's mostly decent, clean, things like that. Most people are not doing drugs. They're families. They're pretty much safe, right? A normal middle class family. Uh, let's just say somebody, right, um, steals, right? Let's just say that they shoplift. Does that mean that, even though for the most part people don't shoplift, it happens, but it doesn't happen frequently. It happens every now and then, and usually when it does happen, that person is apprehended and put in jail. Would it be fair to say, so because of that one instance of shoplifting, therefore all of that city, everybody in that city is a shoplifter? No, right? So it's the same analogy, guys. Masculinity itself is not toxic, but are there certain forms of masculinity that can be toxic? Absolutely. And so, what about the concept of toxic masculinity as a whole? Well, I think the concept of toxic masculinity, you have to understand, there's a lot of false ideology creeping in the social sciences, and those terms don't have a meaning, right? They're very ambiguous. So a lot of times in the social sciences, those things are not very heavily discussed because they're more discussed by popular writers and the media and the popular culture. It's not something that is talked about in most social science departments, except if you're talking about like gender studies, and like even then, like a lot of the radical feminist groups tend to speak about those topics. But in general, though, those things are not talked about scientifically because for the most part, they're very speculative, hypothetical terms. They're like buzz terms. They're not very scientifically valid. And so it's not worth thinking about so much because we don't have to classify everything into a category, right? So just because somebody does an aggressive act and they're a male, it doesn't mean that that's toxic masculinity, because what else is going to happen? We're going to start classifying toxic masculinity based on degrees, right? Okay, this is first degree toxic masculinity, second degree toxic masculinity, third degree toxic masculinity, and so on and so forth, to the point where social science is not even going to become a science anymore. It's just going to become some sort of hobby or some sort of art, right? Like even art doesn't proceed like that. So I would say it's better to think about it in terms of morality rather than a set of characteristics, because there's no genetic component or anything that's inherent that directly causes people to commit crimes. Now, I know there are certain books, for example, the Bell Curve talks about the relationship between IQ and criminality, and they've shown that, like lower IQ tends to be correlated with higher rates of criminality. But again, correlation is not causation, right? Most people who have a low IQ or an average IQ do not commit crime. You actually do not need that high of an IQ to be a moral, upstanding citizen, right? And so that's the problem with that. It falls under the same fallacy with toxic masculinity, is because they see one or two instances that where a masculine person commits a crime, and so they generalize and they say all masculinity is toxic. I want you guys to stay away from that kind of thinking. Think rationally, think empirically, think scientifically, right? Don't think emotionally, because thinking emotionally is only going to land you in a lot of trouble, and it's just going to confuse you. And not only that, but ultimately it will make you distrust others and suspect them for no reason whatsoever. So I just wanted to explain that to you guys. I hope it helps you, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.